Okay, hello everyone. I'm here with Stephen Rosen. I hope I've said that correctly.
You
Um,
did?
Thank you very much. And Stephen is the author of Tone Chaser, and I believe you've just done a third edition to this book. Is that correct?
That's correct. So, just a little bit of backstory here, Ramon. I was a music journalist beginning around 1973. Uh, on a night in July 1977, I meet Edward Van Halen at the Whiskey. He's there to see Cheap Trick record a live record. I'm there to see Cheap Trick record a live record. And we were introduced to each other, and we sort of hung out together off and on for the next 26 years until 2003. Um, the relationship kind of ended in fragments. I'm sad to say, and I write about that in Tone Chaser. So fast forward to 2003, I sit down and I start writing the book. 14 months later, I come out with the first edition. And yes, we're now in the third edition. And it's been pretty remarkable. I mean, the response has been extraordinary. Um, the book is much different than the other Van Halen books out there, and those books are fantastic in their own right. But I was friends with Edward, and so we had sort of this, deeper kind of a relationship that happened. I wouldn't just, you know. Go up to 5150 and do an interview and then leave. We would just we spend time together as friends would do. So the book is really about sort of who was this person, maybe when he wasn't on the stage, and some of the more personal things in his life, his family, and that type of thing. So yeah, and as I was writing it, I realized that a lot of these moments I was talking about, they were pretty personal. And I wasn't sure, well, how are hardcore fans going to react? Because Van Halen fans are hardcore, man. They love him, they love the band. They have this image in their head. And I understand that. So some of the moments were, uh, just him being a human being. So I wasn't sure how people were going to react. People have reacted incredibly in an understanding way. They understand what it was. They understand our relationship, um, and I think they've walked away with sort of a deeper insight into who this human being really was. July '77. So their first album would not even come out for another 8 months, right? That first record comes out in February '78. And he was just, I really didn't know that much about him. I had heard about him. All my writer buddies were talking about it. Oh my God, you got to see this guy, Eddie Van Halen, play. He's amazing. He's going to blow you away. So when I was introduced to him that night by my very good friend, Michelle Meyer, Michelle booked the Whiskey. And she knew I was writing for guitar magazines. I was writing for Guitar Player at the time. Um, she knew I was always sort of looking out for the next new guitar player. So she said, hey, there's somebody, you need to meet upstairs. So we walk upstairs to one of the Whiskey dressing rooms, which looked like and smelled like the bottom of an ashtray. I mean, there's cigarette butts and there's empty beer cups, and all kinds of stuff in there. And I see this guy standing in the corner and he's smoking a cigarette, and he would be smoking a cigarette literally every time I was with him, and more than one. And that always disturbed me, but we can maybe talk about that later on. And I could tell that he wasn't expecting company. I mean, he was in his own little cocoon there. But we walk over, and she introduces us, and we kind of, shake hands and say hello. And I don't know how the conversation got there, but we started talking about Eric Clapton, and I was a massive Clapton fan. I mean, I loved Cream era Clapton, and going back, prior to that, he's doing the he was in various blues bands. I knew a lot about him, So I kind of had this snob thing going on. If I was talking to you and you made a comment about Eric Clapton that I deemed below my radar, it's like I would be very dismissive. Like, well, this guy doesn't know shit about Eric Clapton. So we're talking, and not that I wanted to hear him make a mistake, but I was just wired that way. So we're talking, and we start talking about Clapton, and I realized that Edward didn't maybe necessarily know Clapton's history, but he understood him as a guitar player and as a guy who played through Marshalls and was going for tones, So he's talking about Eric's tone, and he's talking about, his vibrato and how he's phrasing things. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this guy is going deeper than I ever could into his actual playing. Look, I was a guitar player. I was never a good guitar player, but I understood guitar. I could talk to guitar players. But I thought this guy is going deeper into that, and I thought that was so amazing. And so he talks about Clapton. We talked about Blackmore, talked about Jeff Beck. And, I knew that Van Halen had signed a deal with Warner's, and they had gotten a massive record deal. And I thought that was just astonishing. I was playing in bands at the time, and I was thinking, my God, if I ever got close to a record deal on a major label, I would be, spouting it to the world. And when you talk about an anecdotal moment, this is who Edward was. I brought it up, and he was almost like, oh, shucks, yeah, man, we got a deal. It's like, you're kidding me. I'm right. If it was me, if it was you, it'd be like, dude, we got a fucking deal on Warner's and we're going out on the road. You know what I mean? He wasn't like that. So I said, well, how do you think the record's going to do? He goes, well, I think we made a pretty good record. I don't know. I think it'll do okay. And it was that moment that really unveiled who he was. He was always that person. People say he's humble and this and that. Well, yeah, he was, but I don't think people understand in what ways he was humble. But he truly was that person. It was a pretty amazing moment. And so we're talking, and then at one point he just runs out of the room. I'm kind of standing there thinking, is he gone? Is he gone home or something? And he comes back in, and he's got a pen. And he picks up some kind of piece of paper off the floor, and is writing something, hands it to me, and it's his phone number.
Wow. And
he goes, hey, man, I really had a good time talking to you. Call me. I hope we can talk again.
Incredible.
And that's who this guy was. And then 8 months later, I get the first Van Halen record in the mail. And I got to sort of tie these points together here, Ramon. And I thought, oh my God, there's that guy, and we see him on the cover with, what I thought was some kind of a Strat, which it kind of was, but it's a black and white guitar, and I thought, oh, it's a humbucker in there. That's amazing. I never really seen that before. And so I put it on, and the first track, I hear the gong, 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 Running with the Devil. And I'm thinking, oh, this is pretty cool. And then I keep listening, and I kind of just needle drop on various spots around the record, and I wasn't blown away. I honestly didn't think it was very good. I could not understand what people were talking about. All my writer buddies, they had blown up in Hollywood. I mean, they were like the big thing in Hollywood on the Strip, And I thought, my God, what am I missing? So the next day, I sit down, as you are, with a big cup of coffee, and I sit down and listen more carefully, and I go, oh my God, that's what everybody was hearing. There's the tone. You've just never heard anything like that. It was so dynamic, and it was so big, and yet the articulation when he played, it was right. It was there in every note, and he hit a chord, and it was like that. These arpeggios would kind of ring out, and it was kind of like a three-piece. Recording live, so whenever he would go into a solo, there was no rhythm guitar, which I loved. I love that approach. Yeah. There's a couple tracks where there's backing guitar tracks, right? But I got it. I understood it, And I honestly, I kind of realized at that moment, not that I was any, seer oracle. I thought, this is going to change everything. This is a guitar tone I've never heard. And I'd interviewed the greatest, and I'd heard the greatest guitar tones in the world, and I'd seen those concerts with Jeff Beck and Zeppelin and the Who and Free. I mean, I'd heard those guitar tones, and that's what I grew up on. And I thought, this is sort of that thing, but made modern, somehow brought into the future, as it were.
Stephen,
yeah.
Did Eddie ever tell you why he kind of took to modding his guitars? Did he ever tell you why? Because he really was.
Sorry. I'm sorry, Ramon. Why he took to customizing?
Yeah, why did he customize it? Because he was, there wasn't many people around then that would customize their own guitars, were there?
Right. No, there weren't. And it's really, if Edward had done nothing more than done that and put a humbucker in a Strat, his legend would have been sealed. It's interesting because there were some guys who had been putting humbuckers in Telecasters. So that had been done, but for some reason, no one had ever put a humbucker in a Strat, which just seems amazing, as you pointed out. With Edward, I don't think it was a thought process whereby, I'm just going to see what happens if I put this pickup in this guitar, or if I cut this off, if I cut the horn off an Explorer or an SG, which he famously did. Now, yes, part of it, yes, there was the experimenter in him, but I really believe it was more the tone chaser mentality. He was hearing this thing in his head, and how do I find that? And I think everything was an extension of that. Well, I love Strats, and I love people who play Strats, but it's not quite the sound I want. I wanted something beefier, I kind of hear that in guys playing Les Pauls. So hence, what did it sound like if I put a humbucker in a Strat? So I think it was a function of that, as opposed to just kind of pursuing that just to pursue it and see what came out of it. Look, at the end of the day, of course, he was looking for something, but I don't think it was some sort of an extraneous thing. Let's just try this, For him, guitars, amps, pedals, guitar picks were tools. And so it was really just finding the perfect tool, because he treated his guitars really pretty badly. I'd be at the 5150, man, and the guitars would be on the fucking floor of the studio, and they were kind of tossed around, and the cigarette burns, on all the headstocks. So, I think it was just that tone chaser mentality coupled to the inventor, luthier, person in him. Yeah.
And Stephen, did you get an insight into how he recorded the guitar? How he recorded? Would he be would he record live with a band? Like some bands, they record the backing track live, and then some guitar players sit in the control booth and play lots of solos over the top. Did you get any insights of how the band recorded? How he did these guitar solos?
We actually talked about that. I'm sorry, Ramon. We actually talked about that at length, and forgive me if I don't remember all of the details, but there's a couple chapters of that in the book that are really amazing. Right. And it's not like I'm trying to sell books here, but we did talk about that stuff. It's hard for me to remember specifically all the things he said. And the other thing that's really interesting is that this is probably, and I believe it really is, the first time he ever talked about that anyone ever asked him those questions. He did record live in the studio. It was always the live band. Again, there was sometimes when he would go back and put on a couple backing tracks, Jamie's Crying and Ain't Talking About Love, I think, from the first record. But it was always a live approach with him. And he even said famously, he didn't really know how to overdub. He didn't really know what that was. Mm-hmm. We know that he went in the studio prior to getting the deal with Warner's with Gene Simmons, and they did some demos. And Edward would play a part and then break off into a solo. And Gene said, "No, don't play it that way. play the rhythm part all the way through and then come back and overdub the solo. And Edward didn't understand what that meant. And he was almost incapable of doing it because, you know, muscle memory, you know, you're playing up to the second chorus,
Yeah.
and you go into a solo. He didn't understand, well, I've never played chords over that section, you know, but it was pretty much live. I don't think he spent much time at all sort of reworking solos. You know, there's all of that lore and the nerds about, you know, the Variac and the Marshall. Some people said there was a bandmaster in there. Some people said there was a smaller kind of Fender amps. And again, I believe he does talk about that. I think what was so remarkable about him again is I think he knew and understood that his guitar tone was pretty amazing. I don't think he had any sense in a million years that he had sort of created this guitar sound that was going to be mimicked and copied for decades to come. You know, somebody with a bigger ego would have said, "Oh my God, man, I built a guitar, and can you listen to this guitar sound I got?" So for him, I don't think he was ever aware of that. You know how extraordinary it was, the things that he was doing. You know, to pull up that Variac. You know, again, he talks about lying about it, that he said he would turn it up higher than it was because he didn't want other people kind of copying it. Which I always found so amazing. I'm sorry, go ahead.
That was what people termed the Brown sound.
Yeah, exactly.
The Brown sound, yeah.
Exactly. You know, I mean, one, it's extraordinary that his mind would even think to use that kind of an electronic component, right? I mean, that's brilliant unto itself, right? Nobody else ever did it. You know, it's kind of like overloading your amp. I get it, but in a different way. And again, he would kind of lie about, you know, the settings he would use because he didn't kind of want other people doing that for fear that they would sound like him. You know, which ties into him in the early shows. He would turn around on stage because he didn't want people to watch it. I just find that it was really unlike him because later on, I don't think he ever thought that way at all. I mean, look, you could have seen him play live. You could have seen the tapping thing. You could have gotten that Variac, put it on your amp on the same setting, and you weren't going to sound anything like him, you know. But for him to think like that, it was almost, it was so kind of naive. It was charming. Do you know what I mean? It was pretty amazing, really.
Yeah, because his mum from I can't remember what country she was from. I think it was his mum. I think he was part Dutch, wasn't he?
Yeah. And she was from Indonesia.
She was from Indonesia. So in that respect, you know, he must have, you know, maybe he heard, you know, some Indonesian music, who knows, or some, you know, obviously in Holland, but then he came to America and heard Cream, and like we all heard Cream, and that was it, game over.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean?
You know, that's an interesting point. So let me back up just a bit here to respond to your comment here, Ramon. It's 1985. I have known Edward at that point for about 8 years. They recorded the 1984 record. He's the biggest guitar player in the world. Arguably, Van Halen is a monster band. The journalist in me starts thinking, you know, man, there's going to be writers who are going to approach him and they're going to want to write his life story. And I'm thinking, I want to be that person, you know. So after months and months of trying to build up the fucking balls to ask him this question, hey, Eddie, can I write the story of your life? I finally found the courage to ask him. And he said, yes, I can't think of anybody else doing it but you, which was a pretty remarkable thing for him to say. So for about the next 4 years, I started gathering interviews, friends, promoters, you know, bandmates. I interviewed the band in what I was hoping was going to be his authorized biography. I asked Edward sort of many times, Edward, listen, man, we need to sit down and do some more interviews for the book. by 85, I interviewed him a lot for guitar magazines, Guitar World over here, a bunch of European magazines, Japanese magazines. So we talked about all the gear and all that stuff. That was covered. But I needed to talk to him about what was that like? Did your mom have records from Indonesia? Did you ever hear Indonesian music? And following along in that thread, what was your life like in growing up in Europe? And what was it like going to school there? Your dad was a musician, and we talked a little bit about this, right? His dad was a horn player, and I think that was a huge influence on him and the sounds he was hearing as well. So, how big an influence was that on you? Do you think if your dad was never a musician, you would have been a musician? Anyway, there were so many questions I wanted to ask him, and that's the kind of a question I would have loved to have asked him. Wow. Did that kind of ethnic music ever get into your brain that maybe somehow colored your approach to what ultimately became the Brown sound? So yeah.
And of course, Alex, his brother was a drummer, and so there was a very musical family, and
very musical. Yeah. Right. So we all know the story that initially Edward was playing drums and Alex was playing guitar, and Edward came home and saw Alex playing, and I mean, and again, he talks about it in more detail in the book, but they somehow made that change. Alex was a very talented musician. They both played keyboards, and I think that's another element that maybe doesn't get talked about. Look, I don't know how much classical music Edward actually listened to, but I would imagine, because he was learning classical pieces, because he was learning piano from a classical music teacher, certainly he would have heard some of that stuff. And, calling his son Wolfgang and his middle name Ludwig, right? Ludwig for, he must have heard that stuff. And so hearing that orchestral stuff, certainly you could put that tag on classical orchestra, right, as a Brown sound, right? You wouldn't call the music from a classical orchestra as blue or purple, right? It would be brown, that organic thing. But Alex was a very talented musician in his own right. Played keyboards, was a very good violin player, also played some horns. So yeah, man, it was in the DNA, passed down from the father to the sons, and obviously from Edward to his son. And Alex's son is also a musical guy. So yeah, in the blood.
I wanted to ask you a couple of controversial questions. What did he ever speak to you about the parting with the bass player Michael Anthony?
It wasn't. It wasn't so much specifically talking about that, but there were moments early on, and I mean really early on in the band's history, and he would talk about sort of being dissatisfied with what Michael was bringing to the band. And he said the same things about Dave. Look, he never discounted their contributions, that Dave obviously was the singer. Dave was sort of Dave had a lot to do with the look of the band, the videos. Obviously, he wrote the lyrics and the melodies. But I think he felt that Dave and Mike somehow sort of disrespected the music. Dave was supposed to be in pre-production for an album, and Dave was off climbing a mountain somewhere in South America. And to Edward, that's disrespect. Well, if I'm here, why isn't he here? And with Michael, I think it was the same kind of thing. Edward, kind of wanted Michael. He told me that Michael never called him up and said, "Hey, man, let's get together and just hang and play a little bit." Look, not that band members do that routinely, but with Edward, it was like he needed to feel that, On the other side of that, I have to say here, he loved those guys, he loved them like brothers. And he said that many times. But I think at times he just felt that they weren't bringing to the band what he brought to the band. Look, nobody was going to be able to do that because he lived and breathed that band 24 hours a day, right? Not even Alex, I think, could keep up with Edward in terms of all the time that he spent on it. So that's really about as deeply as we got into it. And then, Mike going off to play with Sammy. After Sammy leaves the band, I don't think that sat real well with him either.
Mm-hmm.
But he also told me, he goes, listen, and some of these comments were made to me like the second record. I mean, early. But he also said to me, he goes, look, I totally understand that this band is these four guys, and if any of these members got changed or whatever, it would be an entirely different band. So there was never ever that thought, oh, I'm going to kick out Mike, oh, I'm going to kick out Dave because they're not acting the way I think they should. That was never going to happen, at least at that point, right? So
wow, that's really and talking about his health, because the thing about Eddie is he always had his top off and he was always ripped. He always looked really healthy. You know what I mean?
I do, man. It's unbelievable. I mean, I was lucky enough to kind of be close to him a lot, not with his shirt off, but I would look at his arm, those fucking veins and his hands, man. And I remarked on it, how huge his hands were. There's a poster of Jimi Hendrix and his thumb goes all the way over the fretboard. So Hendrix had those hands. Steve Vai had those hands. Look, it's no accident that he was able to do those things. If he had fat little pudgy hands like I did, trust me, he wouldn't have played like Edward Van Halen. But yes, his health, I always was astonished. And it's another thing I wish I could have asked him. Ed, he ate like shit. Every time he was over, hey man, got anything to munch on? So I'd give him potato chips. Sometimes I had like these horrible tasting, nutrient bars, which were halfway healthy, but all he ever ate were McDonald's and pizza.
Yeah.
He smoked and he drank. And I mean, beer, right? It's all sugar. It's all calories. Yeah. I never saw him. Yeah, you saw him. My God, all the way up until really the point when we kind of much later, we realized that he was kind of sick. Yeah. From his treatment, he was kind of gaining weight. I could never understand. And I think he told me one time, that he jumped rope.
Really?
Which is an amazing aerobic exercise, I guess, good for your arms.
Yeah.
But my God, you'd have to jump for hours to burn off those calories.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could never understand it. Look, let's face it. He was an amazing looking guy, right? We know about the smile, man, but he had the cheekbones.
The hair.
He had this, oh my God, his hair. And Neil Zlozauer, who's a good buddy, Neil was Van Halen's official photographer.
Yeah.
And Neil shot a lot of pictures, and I looked through them because Neil kindly donated the 3 photos that are on the 3 editions of my book. He gave me those photos. So I looked through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photos. And Edward Van Halen never took a bad photo in his fucking life. His hair, I mean, he couldn't look bad. His hair, he cut it, and that's what, the clothes hung so perfectly on him. Look, I don't mean to be glib or maybe I'm totally wrong. If Edward Van Halen weighed 280 pounds, was just a normal looking guy, would he have been Edward Van Halen? Look, he still would have been remarkably successful, but look, let's face it, he had every piece and it was all perfect, so
there you go. I mean, and just coming back from a guitarist point of view, then he got into the whole he had his PV, he had the PV period, he had the Ernie Ball. I think the Ernie Ball guitar came first, didn't it? And then he went to the PV one later. That's right. And did you discuss any of that sort of thing with him about why he was going into that kind of why he built this guitar? Why? Because I think one of them they only had one pickup, or maybe they had 2. I can't remember, but they were interesting.
No. those specific kinds of questions, Edward, why did you do that? Why did you go use those? Because we never got into. But um, we did talk a fair amount about Kramer, which is his first,
Yeah.
company he went with, and we talked about it a fair bit. And I was actually there the night when he was. I was up at 5150 when he was deciding whether he should go with Kramer or not. And one of the big regrets that I have was not saying to him, do not do that. Don't be a fucking idiot. Do not put your name on a guitar. To me,
Mm-hmm.
his allure was that whole DIY, do it yourself, built his guitars, a kid in a garage, destroying pickups, cutting things, putting the pickup directly into the body, working the tremolo. That would look, that's part of his history. And again, the way he looked without that backdrop, without the fact that he built his own guitars, does he go on to become impossible to say, but that was a huge part of it. I could never understand, and it goes back to some of my first comments, Ramon, about him not understanding this guitar tone that he had created and not understanding his own legacy. I don't think he really understood, even so I'm bad with the years. I don't know what year that was when he started using Kramer's, 84 or 85 or something. But I don't think he understand what it meant lending his name to a company. And I should have said something. I never did. I suppose, look, you can be friends with somebody and there's a line that you can't cross.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think what he should have done, he should have gone to Kramer and said, look, I want 10 guitars built to these specs. I'm going to play them live. I'll play them in the studio, but you can't use my name, and I'm not going to lend my name to it.
Yeah.
They would have fallen over themselves. Any company in the world would have fallen over themselves. I don't think, maybe somehow he thought that he could command that, like, I think it was a mistake. Look, I'm not talking about the quality of the guitars. Obviously, the fact that he played them, they were very good guitars. I just didn't get it. In the end, did they do anything to contribute to his legacy? I don't think they did anything other than for guitar guys to go, oh, he's using the Kramer, this one, you know what I mean? And then look, again, ultimately, yeah, right, the PV and the Ernie Ball, and then the Wolfgang guitars. Look, I know they're all great guitars. I don't know. To me, it kind of, it's something he didn't have to do. I think he made a mistake in doing it. And one other little anecdote I want to tell you here. I was with Edward at the NAMM show. So for those who don't know, the NAMM show, although your audience probably knows, is the big National Association of Music Merchants.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Right. Once a year or twice a year. I think there's one in Anaheim, California, one I think in Chicago.
Yep.
Where all the guitar builders and amp builders and keyboards and DJs and everybody comes together, and retailers are there, and now it's really become more of a kind of a hangout. Really, I don't know how much business actually gets done, but anyway, back in the day, so Kramer's there, and who are they gonna trot out? Fucking Edward Van Halen. And I was with him a couple times at least, and he hated doing that stuff. And I'm thinking, why would you do this? And I think maybe I'd asked him once, and he said, oh man, I committed to it. I go, but so that's part of the anecdote. The other part is we're talking, and I think I said to him once, Edward, why do you do that? Why do you go to those shows? You hate it so much,
Yeah.
And he goes, well, I owe it to him or something, I said, man, I don't get it, man. They're really taking advantage of you. And he told me that the president of the company, and I use his name in the book, I don't want to say it here, but had been reaching out to Steve Vai, because Steve Vai was like the new kid in town.
Yeah.
And Edward is now, playing second base. And for Edward talking about disrespect. Oh my fucking God.
Yeah.
I believe it probably wasn't long after that he jumped ship and went to
Ernie Ball or
Ernie Ball,
yeah,
one of those.
yeah,
And then he had the falling out with Ernie Ball, right? Ernie Ball Music Man, or Ernie Ball, and then went to PB, and then, so
mm-hmm.
yeah, those are my feelings. There's guys out there going to say, "Oh, you're fucking crazy, man. The Kramer was the greatest sounding guitar he ever played." That might very well be. I don't agree with that. I mean, there's nothing than those guitar tones on those first 4 records. Those are all his guitars. But legacy is an important thing. I just don't think he was self-aware enough. Somebody should have told him.
Yeah.
And don't fucking.
Yeah.
I don't get it. Anyway.
And Stephen, and because with Alan Holdsworth, his kind of demise was a little bit similar to Eddie's in as much as that the drink got the better of Alan Holdsworth, and he couldn't in the end play because he's there's a whole story there we won't have time to go into, but because I remember watching a more recent NAMM show where Eddie was obviously had one wine too many. I don't know if you've seen those YouTube clips, and I thought that was it, game over. But then he came back again and they had I think they even did a gig with Dave Lee Roth, and his playing was back. He was playing great.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I can't remember what year that was, but that was some kind of a NAMM show, and there's some horrible videos of him where he's really out of it, on wine or and he's playing. The playing is not as clean as it once was, but obviously because he's one wine too many. It's like you can't drink and drive. You know what I mean?
Right, exactly. I think he was. Look, man, he'd been drinking since he was 13 years old, right? Mm-hmm. European families, right? They have a little glass of wine for lunch with the father, that kind of thing. His playing did get a little, you could hear it. The tour, right? It's right. 2003 or is that?
Yeah.
So the 2004 or 2005 tour. That tour or somewhere right around there.
So, Stephen, just before we go, can you give us one last anecdote of your time with Eddie?
Oh my gosh, there are a ton of them. A couple stick out in my mind. This one is remarkable in and of itself, but it also reveals exactly who he was, which is the first comment I made about sort of that humility and not understanding who he was or how he was changing the world of guitar. So I'm up at 5150, and he's changing guitar strings on one of his guitars. And there were always a ton of guitars up there. I mean, they were lying around, they were in stands, and all these other guitars, were all strung, and there's 1,000 Kramers and, all those other exotic guitars. And he could have played any of them, but he had to restring this guitar, So he's, taking the strings off, and, the studio is beautiful. I mean, it's like this, these cabinets, these ultra high quality cabinets. I mean, they're beautiful. I mean, there's everything in the studio you could imagine. I mean, there's more outboard gear, and there's microphones and cables, and excuse me, you can imagine. So he goes and he opens some doors, and he's looking around for a set of strings, and he doesn't find any, and he opens another cabinet, he's looking, and he pulls out a drawer, and he's looking, and he pulls out another drawer, and he's looking. He cannot find a set of guitar strings. There is everything in this studio you could ever imagine and ever want. He can't find a set of guitar strings. And again, there's 50 other guitars all strung, but he can't play any of those. So he says, let's go get a set of strings. And I don't know what he's talking about. So what do? We go outside, and he's got kind of like a big parking area, and it's full of his Lamborghinis, and he had the Porsches, and the Jeeps painted like the guitars with the red, white, and black. I mean, so we go and we get into a Countach, with the scissor doors, and I'd never been in one. So he's like this lanky guy. He kind of falls into the sheet, I'm getting there, I'm trying to put one foot in, but then I can't close the fucking door, and I got to get, and he's just sitting there, and I felt like an idiot. I really couldn't get in. I finally figured it out, and I get in. Edward lived about 10 minutes away from a guitar center in Sherman Oaks. Edward lived in Coldwater Canyon. Sherman Oaks is just kind of like the next town over. So we go blazing down the street, and I mean, he drives exactly how you would expect him to drive, right? So he goes blazing down the street, and he's taking these corners, and I'm thinking, this is as fucking great as it's ever going to get, right? I'm on Ventura Boulevard, big street, with Edward Van Halen in his Countach. I mean, I figured, look, man, if we crash now, my name goes up and lights with him, right? Journalists die, I hate to be morbid, but, so we go to the guitar center, and he screams into the parking lot, and he walks in, and there were some people shopping around, and there's a guy behind the desk. And, the second Edward walks in, I mean, the guy's eyes like are pinwheels. He recognized him instantly, I thought the guy was going to like fall over. I thought he was going to have a heart attack there. So we walk over, and the guy, can I help you, Edward says, I need a set of strings, And the guy says, okay. And I think the guy goes off to get the strings for it. Edward even tells him what he wants. Edward used Fenders back in the day. And the guy comes like, oh, man, what do you need? I said of Fenders, So the guy brings back a set of Fenders. Edward goes to pull out his wallet, and, he's looking, I can see him looking in, and so he says, hey, man, can I borrow $10 for strings? I go, of course, I mean, you have to understand, we've just left his $1.5 million studio, gotten into his $150,000 car, and he doesn't have $10 on him for strings, and he has no credit card. At least he has no credit card on him. So the guy gives him a set of strings, and what's more remarkable, he doesn't buy 2 sets of strings or 5 sets of strings. He buys 1 set of strings. So, he gets the strings, and we're leaving, and we get back into his car. I'm driving back, and he pulls into a liquor store, and he says, hey, man, can I borrow $20 for some beer? I go, yeah, you can borrow $20 for beer, And what makes the story so amazing, if you think about it, well, one, yes, he had no money on him. Okay, so that's one thing. You'd expect him to have, lots of money, But the second thing is, instead of calling up the studio manager and screaming, how come there are no guitar strings? Bring me, a dozen sets. He says, let's go jump into my car and go buy guitar strings. Now, I can bet you that Jimmy Page doesn't go into a guitar store and buy his own guitar strings. And Jeff Beck never did it. And neither do any of these other, amazing shred guys, But for him, it was no more than, I need strings on this guitar at this moment. I'm going to go buy strings. Never thought in his head that, hey, I'm Edward Van Halen, that, I don't buy my own guitars. You know what I mean? He just never thought like that. And I thought that moment captured so perfectly who he was.
Yeah, because I mean, Eddie Van Halen wasn't just famous with guitar players. He was famous with everyone. You didn't have to be just a guitar player to know him. You know what I mean?
Right. Exactly. And
everyone knew him.
Exactly. Part of my, sort of my guerrilla promotion, as it were, is reaching out. Well, obviously reaching out to people like you who, have followers who are guitar players, who might be interested in the Van Halen book. And I've reached out to a lot of guitar players, but I've reached out to like sports people, like coaches for teams, classical musicians, conductors of orchestras, because who doesn't know about Edward Van Halen? Now, whether some of those people were fans or not is another thing, but everybody knew Edward Van Halen.
Yeah.
And it was a rare thing, because if you really think about when Edward was coming up, I mean, there were some other incredibly good guitar players around at the time, right? I mean, George Lynch and Warren DeMartini, Rusty Anderson, who later went on to become Paul McCartney's guitar player, an incredibly good guitar player. But I don't think any of them, and it's no insult to any of them, but I don't think any of them would have been known by anybody outside the world of kind of rock guitar. You know what I mean? But
Yeah, and
somehow,
it's like Michael Jackson wanted to call on the best guitarist around to do that solo on "Beat It," and he called Quincy Jones called Eddie Van Halen, even though Steve Lukather, Steve Lukather was a very competent guitar player and could have done a great solo, but Quincy Jones wanted something a bit extra. He wanted the best, and he got the best.
Absolutely, and Quincy, as brilliant as he was, realized that Edward Van Halen transcended all musical styles, as you pointed out, and he was a celebrity. I mean, he was hanging out with sports guys. He was just one of those people, and what that thing is, I don't know. Very few.
One anecdote I want to say from my childhood was, I remember going to the cinema and watching the film, Back to the Future. And, you see, because he's, Marty McFly is trying to be Eddie Van Halen in the beginning, where he kind of blows himself up. And then there's the other scene where he's like an invader from Mars. And he George McFly, he puts the headphones on and plays some Van Halen guitar playing really loud in his ears. And then obviously there's Chuck Berry. So that film references, Chuck Berry and Edward Van Halen, the two legends of guitar,
Exactly.
Of course. There were other. Yeah, sorry, I was going to say that there's other legends, but in the 80s, in the 1980s, Eddie Van Halen really was not the number one guy.
Oh, there's no question. So Edward transcended the world of rock and roll to becoming, yes, a cultural hero, right? And he's in an episode. There's a TV show that was called 2.5 Men with Charlie Sheen. Edward walks out of the bathroom playing guitar. He becomes a caricature in The Simpsons. There's probably 10 other. There's the movie Fast Times at Ridgemont High. The kid scalping tickets is scalping Van Halen tickets, because whether you knew anything about music, you knew the name Van Halen. So yes, he transcended that, and that's a rare quality, man. I mean, to be able to do that. So yeah, he was special.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for coming on the Guitar Show, Stephen. And where can fans of obviously Eddie Van Halen and the listeners of the Guitar Show, where can they get this your book Tone Chaser from?
You can get the book in a couple places. You can get it on my website, which is very simple: tonechaserbook.com. One word: tonechaserbook.com. If you people feel more comfortable on Amazon, you can find it on Amazon. And it's also actually on eBay and Reverb. So if you're on Reverb buying a pedal, go buy my book and stomp on your pedal while reading my Tone Chaser book. But for Van Halen fans, and I say this with all due modesty, it's a really interesting look at this Edward Van Halen character, and I think you'll come away with it learning some stuff that maybe you didn't know before, and as the title implies, just a better understanding of who he was. So go out and buy the book.
Of course, and it's been a real pleasure, because for me it's amazing that you were friends with Eddie and you actually knew him, and that's a difference. You're not writing from a distance; you're actually writing from a first-hand account. You know what I mean?
Right. No, absolutely. And I was lucky. I mean, how does How do things like that happen in the world? I don't know. You know, is it destiny? Is it synchronicity? But yes, and I did see things, and we talked about things that that he would never did talk about with other writers, which made writing that book not only more insightful, but also, as I probably touched on earlier, more difficult to write about, because sometimes we're talking as friends and like, oh, do I really talk about this now, all these years later? And you know, so that was a difficult tightrope to walk. In the end, I was as honest and as transparent as I could have been. I think the book is really remarkable. It's an homage to my buddy, and I think fans will dig it. So,
Fantastic.
yeah.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks, Ramon. It was great, buddy.
Thanks.
Bye.